The movie begins with a newlywed couple, Julia and Francis, who are moving to the city of Bucharest, Romania. The bride is American, and her husband is Romanian. They are moving to the country because of Francis's work. The couple is inside a taxi, and Francis is speaking in Romanian with the driver, a language that Julia does not understand. Francis realizes that his wife is lost about his conversation with the driver, and so he decides to interpret their discussion for her. Julia learns from her husband that the taxi driver had been asking if they had any family left in Romania. The driver, on hearing that Julia doesn't speak their language, expresses his shock to the woman in English. He then compliments her in his native language, calling her beautiful, but the possessive husband tells the driver to know his limits. The couple clings to each other throughout the ride till they finally arrive at their destination. As they come down from the vehicle, the two remove their luggage and head into their new home. Just as the two make their way inside, we see a mysterious individual peeking through their window, monitoring the arrival of the couple. The owner of the apartment leads Julia and Francis into their house, and the two are impressed with the layout of the place. The woman is somewhat satisfied with the couple's reaction, and she leaves the two to settle in. Later that night, while the couple lay in bed asleep, Julia suddenly wakes up to the sound of rain pouring outside. She stands up and looks through the blurry windows, finding comfort in the soothing sounds of the rain. As she looks on, she sees someone on the other block looking directly at her from their window. Is it a coincidence? Whatever the case, Julia isn't bothered. Francis wakes up and sees his wife standing by the window. He inquires if she had trouble sleeping. Julia apologizes for waking him up and goes back to bed beside him. The man tells her that he'll be leaving early for work the next day, and she asks him to wake her up when he's ready to leave in the morning. The next day, Julia wakes up to a text from Francis. He has gone to work already and claims he couldn't bear to interrupt Julia's peaceful sleeping. That day, the woman goes about doing some chores around the house. However, she gets distracted by a loud neighbor. Later, she decides to explore the city. She visits a few places and gets kicked out of a few places as well for trespassing. Communication is a big struggle for the woman as language is a barrier for her. As a result of this, life becomes tedious and somewhat lonely. One day she returns home and finds the door to the apartment open. Julia is immediately alert as she slowly approaches the entrance of the house. She sees strange individuals in her home but soon realizes it's just the apartment owner, who had come with someone to fix up the lights in the house. In the next scene, we see Julia sitting all by herself in the living room, dressed up and having a glass of wine. She then walks up to the window, and there she finds this same strange man from the opposite block, monitoring her closely from his window. Now it's becoming concerning for Julia, but she doesn't tell her husband when he returns from work. Francis sees her looking through the window and inquires what the matter is, but she doesn't give him a definite answer. In an attempt to divert his question, she asks him how his day went, but it's just another day at the office for the man. The two then go on to have a pleasant night out. Later, when the couple returns home, the opposite apartment appears to be a crime scene, with people gathered and an ambulance, as well as police cars, scattered all over the place. The curious couple inquires from a woman there about what happened, but she too seems as clueless as them. Just then, Julia sees a man curled up inside the ambulance looking at her sternly. She becomes unsettled and quickly leaves the scene with her husband. Afterwards, while watching the news, Julia sees the reporter on TV talking about the incident at the apartment. Julia brings her husband's attention to the television. She asks him to interpret what they're saying since the reporter is speaking in Romanian. Francis tells her that a woman's corpse was found by the man they saw earlier sitting in the ambulance. Julia is disturbed by the case, but her husband is not. The unclarity of the whole situation just adds to her anxiety. She finally opens up to Francis about this mysterious individual who is always monitoring her closely from his window at night. Though it's a concerning issue, Julia doesn't want her husband to worry too much about it. Francis assures her that he'll always be there for her in case she needs anything. Julia finds comfort in her husband's words, as well as his arms that are wrapped firmly around her. Later that night, some of Francis's colleagues come to visit. They chat while having dinner. The guests inquire about Julia's acting career, which she reveals was a step in the wrong direction. Just then, Francis brings up the topic of the woman in the neighborhood who had tragically passed away. He narrates how he and his wife went out and returned to the sudden presence of the authorities. Simon, Francis's colleague, has a lot to say about it too. He reveals that the victim's body was found headless, and more disturbingly, there have been other victims before her. There's a serial homicide offender on the loose, and he has even been given a name by the people. They call him the Spider. Not taking this news very well, Julia gets up to clear the table and then takes the trash out. On her way downstairs, she meets a neighbor who introduces herself as Irina. Luckily, this one is fluent in English and also friendly to Julia. Irina apologizes for how loud she gets sometimes and tells Julia to simply inform her when she becomes loud again. The next day, while Julia is on her daily routine around the city, she sees a newspaper headline bearing the case of the woman's corpse that was found. Julia goes on to research the woman in the English language. As she reads about the woman, she stumbles upon the interview of another victim, who affirms the rumors of a predator in Bucharest. This woman in the interview reveals that she was being followed for several days by a strange individual. She states that one day, the stalker invaded her home, smothered her with a pillow, and then slit her throat with a knife. He then creepily sat down next to the woman, watching her bleed out. However, thankfully, she survived. Just after this, Julia begins to feel as though someone is closely following her while she walks down the street. Fortunately, the individual walks past her, clearing her suspicions. Maybe it's just paranoia, so she decides to calm her nerves by going to see a movie. Just when the movie seems to be going well and calming Julia's nerves, someone suddenly comes to sit directly behind her. This is quite concerning, as there are vacant seats to choose from all over the place. But for some reason, this strange individual has decided to sit right behind her. Julia attempts to turn around and look at the face of this man, but her anxiety won't let her. To make things worse, the person slowly leans forward. Julia can feel this strange man on her shoulders, and terrified, she instantly gets up and runs out. She then goes to the grocery store. The poor woman is tense, scared, and possibly being stalked. However, she isn't able to escape her fears at the grocery store. This same suspicious individual has followed her into the supermarket and is now creepily following her around. Julia is too terrified to look this man in the face, and she makes a quick exit through the back door. That night, while having dinner, Julia shares her experiences with her husband. He asks if the strange man followed her to the house, but Julia isn't sure. Francis tries to comfort his wife by leaning in for a kiss, but things get awkward between the couple when Julia reacts oddly to Francis's hands around her neck. He immediately apologizes, sensitive to how the whole stalker situation might be affecting his wife. He then suggests that they head back to the supermarket. They would ask to see the security footage from that day to identify the stalker. The couple make their way to the grocery store, where they meet one of the workers. The employee states that when he saw Julia earlier, he had thought that she was trying to steal. However, Julia explains that she was only hiding from the man who was following her. The employee takes the couple to have a look at the security footage. After watching, Francis appears to be unconvinced, claiming that Julia acted strangely at first, prompting a reaction from the man. Great. Just what the poor scared woman needed. Julia, disappointed by her husband's comment, takes a quick picture of the man appearing on the monitors. The picture Julia has taken, though, is not detailed enough, as only the blurry side profile of the man is revealed. But anything will do at this point. Julia isn't able to sleep throughout the night, and her anxiety worsens. The next day, Francis adds to her misery when he tells her that he'll be out late with clients. Julia doesn't show it, but she is tensed up and uneasy. Francis leaves for work, and throughout the day all Julia can do is look through her window, monitoring the entrance of the opposite apartment. Evening approaches, and Julia begins to anxiously await her husband's return. She calls him to ask when he will be returning, and much to her dismay, Francis won't be home anytime soon. Suddenly, there's a knock on the door. The knocking starts calm and gentle, but it suddenly becomes rapid, frightening Julia. Eventually, the terrified woman opens the door, and she discovers it's just an old woman who wants to find out something from her. Unfortunately, Julia doesn't understand Romanian, frustrating the communication between the two. Just then, Irina, who has just arrived home, helps interpret the old woman's words. She says that the elderly woman is in search of her stray cat, and she wants to find out if Julia has come across it by chance. Realizing that Julia has no information about her lost cat, the old woman leaves. Irina discovers that Julia is at home all by herself, thus she invites her to her place for a drink. The lonely woman instantly agrees. She could use some company at the moment, as she has been on the edge lately. At Irina's home, the atmosphere is lightened as the two women sit to talk over a glass of wine. Irina realizes how tough it might be on Julia, having to suddenly leave her comfort zone and learning to adapt to a new environment, culture, and people. She relates with Julia, as she had the same experience when she had newly moved to London some time ago. Julia's time with Irina is quite comforting, learning new phrases in Romanian, sharing a bottle of wine, and filling the room with laughter. After the pleasant moment with her neighbor, Julia returns home. She throws herself on the couch, tipsy and exhausted. The woman then decides to look out her window again to see if she'll find the strange man watching. As she does, she sees a figure at the window. Julia then decides that maybe it's all in her head, and this mysterious individual isn't looking at her after all. She waves at them, and to her shock, they wave back. This creep is monitoring her for sure, and she's not overreacting. Moments later, Francis returns from work. He finds his wife smoking, a habit she had given up for a while now. Francis knows something has to be wrong for him to find her in this state. He asks what the matter is, and Julia narrates her encounter earlier. Francis is enraged. He angrily walks up to the window, looking for this psychopath that keeps bothering his wife. As Francis looks at the window, he finds nothing. He then decides that the next best decision is to contact the police. Eventually, a policeman arrives. He begins to ask Julia a few questions about this stalker of hers. Julia shows him a picture of who she thinks the creep might be, but the image doesn't tell a lot. He then makes up his mind to go to the apartment where the terrified woman thinks her stalker lives. At first, the cop wants Julia to come with him, but she's uncomfortable with the idea. Francis then volunteers to go with him. Moments later, Francis returns without the cop. Julia is curious as to how everything went at the man's apartment. However, her complaints have been unconvincing so far. Francis feels that Julia is just overreacting and dealing with paranoia as a result of her loneliness. At this point, the poor woman feels unheard by her own husband. She's frustrated by the fact that he doesn't even believe her. It's all becoming overwhelming for her. She's slowly losing her mind. She needs to escape from all of this, but Francis isn't even helping her situation. The poor woman is led to tears as she looks at her husband, knowing that he can't do anything to help. The next day, Julia is outside when she sees the mysterious guy. She then decides to follow him, and by doing so, she ends up in an underground strip club. Inside the club, she discovers that the weird man is a cleaner there alongside Irina, who also works at the establishment. Irina and Julia bump into each other, so they sit to talk. The troubled woman tells her how she ended up at the bar in the first place. She is trying to find out who this strange man really is. Julia tells Irina that this person is a cleaner at the club, so she asks if she knows him specifically. Unfortunately, employees there come and go, so Irina doesn't usually pay attention to anything about them. Before Irina returns to work, she assures Julia that she will look after her. Julia is troubled about the whole situation, so much so that she's beginning to have nightmares about the strange man invading her home and attacking her. That night, as she wakes up from sleep, she begins to hear crashes and loud thuds coming from Irina's apartment. She is immediately concerned about her well-being, so she rushes to Irina's apartment. The woman knocks on Irina's door continually, drawing the attention of other tenants. She's just concerned. Julia's incessant demands to make their way into Irina's apartment and find out what's happening draw the attention of the owner. The landlady believes it's a false alarm and that there's no need to barge into Irina's home, but Julia is persistent. Eventually, the woman agrees, opening Irina's apartment for all of them to enter and investigate. The outcome is rather anticlimactic. It's just the old lady's stray cat messing around. There is no Irina in sight. The landlady is infuriated, and in the next scene, we see her making complaints to Francis. When Francis returns, Julia asks him what the landlady has to say. Her husband tells her that the woman claims to despise troublesome tenants. Francis then proceeds to apologize to his wife for being unavailable most of the time and not having a good work-life balance. He feels his wife may be dealing with a mental disorder and empathizes with her. Later, Julia calls Irina's workplace to inquire about her whereabouts. Strangely, even they too haven't heard from her. Something seems to be wrong. Even after Irina's ex-boyfriend comes looking for her, Julia finds him knocking at her door without a response. She joins him and the two talk about her sudden disappearance. The whole situation is becoming alarming, and Julia collects Irina's phone number from her ex-boyfriend. She calls the number, but the line rings without a response. Irina is unreachable. Julia then asks him for a favor. She tells him about her experiences with the stalker always monitoring her, and how the police have failed her as well. The woman asks him to go to the stranger's apartment and find out why he keeps creeping her out. The man is happy to help, and the two head to the house. They arrive and Julia points at the house she believes her stalker lives in. The man walks up to the door and begins banging on it forcefully, demanding whoever is living there to quit bothering Julia. Despite the loud knocks and strict warnings, no one responds, since the man has done all that he can, thus he leaves. Julia is about to exit the premises as well, but then she stops and decides to go and see the apartment for herself. She summons up her courage and walks up to the door. She knocks on the door, and to her surprise, it's a terrified old man that answers it. Julia apologizes to the elderly and immediately makes her way out of the building. In the elevator, she comes face to face with the mysterious man who lives in that residence. She's inside the elevator heading down, while he sternly watches from outside, his face hidden in the darkness. That night, the policeman Francis had invited earlier comes back to visit the couple. A certain Mr. Weber has pressed charges against the couple for stalking him and threatening his father. The policeman doesn't want the situation to escalate, so he brings the man to their house to settle the issue. He makes Weber and Julia shake hands as a peaceful gesture, hoping to bring calm to the whole situation. As the policeman leaves with Mr. Weber, Francis inquires how the whole situation is affecting his wife. He shares updated news about the woman whose body was found some time ago. Francis tells Julia that the culprit has been apprehended, hinting that there is no reason for his wife to live in fear anymore. That same night, the couple head out for drinks with Francis's colleagues. However, things don't go so well between them. Francis and his friends talk about the criminal who had been caught by the police. The person who has been arrested was the same one Julia saw sitting in the ambulance that night. And since he has a criminal record already, the authorities think he is the serial offender causing havoc around town. Francis believes there's no reason for Julia to feel unsafe anymore, and he even goes ahead to make insensitive jokes in his language about her behavior lately. Julia is immediately offended, though she cannot understand exactly what he is saying. She knows he's making fun of her, and she instantly leaves their company. Outside, the couple argue. Francis complains about being caught up in Julia's fantasy and claims to be entangled in a web of her delusions. The poor woman couldn't feel more hurt by his words. She then decides to head home, leaving him and his friends. On a train, Julia stumbles upon Mr. Weber. He's sitting at the other end of the train, and Julia immediately becomes unsettled when she sees him. The mere fact of being in his presence makes the atmosphere unbearable for Julia. Adding to her dismay, the train experiences some difficulties during the ride and stops halfway for repairs. The poor woman is uneasy, knowing that she's in the same space with the strange man. Just then, he comes to sit in front of her. Mr. Weber begins to tell Julia all about his depressing life history and how he has a bad habit of monitoring people from his window. Weber says that all he has is his sick father, whom he takes care of, hinting that he and Julia only cross paths by coincidence when he goes to purchase things for his old man. He further claims no one ever noticed his constant lurking, and was shocked when Julia waved at him that night. It pleased him so much that a pretty woman like her noticed him. However, he got offended when her husband showed up at his doorstep with the police, followed by the sudden threats his old man received the other day from Irina's ex. Weber says he wants an apology, and an already frightened Julia doesn't hesitate to say sorry to the weird man. Julia looks at the mysterious plastic bag Weber has with him, and can only wonder what its contents are. Soon, Julia hops off the train the first opportunity she gets. She's panting heavily, overwhelmed with various emotions and even unsteady in her feet. The poor woman hurries home. She has had enough of all of this drama. Julia wants to put an end to it once and for all, and to her the best solution is to leave the environment entirely. She wants to live peacefully, and not look over her shoulders every 2 seconds. The poor woman has had enough, and we see her begin to pack her bags seriously. While she's at it, she's interrupted by loud music coming from Irina's room. Julia's curiosity gets the better of her, so she goes to Irina's apartment. She finds the door unlocked and makes her way inside. There, she discovers Irina's headless body. While the woman tries to make sense of this troubling discovery, she suddenly gets attacked from behind. Moments later, she wakes up to see Weber, the psychotic man, begins to confess all of his crimes. Julia was right about him after all. Weber reveals how he had attacked Irina and hid her body in her closet when Julia and the landlady came searching her apartment that night. Francis returns home, interrupting the two. When Julia hears him, she attempts to scream for help. Unfortunately, Weber cuts her throat to prevent her from screaming. At that moment, the poor woman remembers that Irina had told her that she kept a weapon in her drawer to use to protect herself. Julia attempts to get the gun, but unfortunately passes out on her way to the drawer. She lies on the floor, lifeless, while Weber watches her bleed out, relishing the moment. On the other hand, Francis sees that Julia is nowhere to be found and attempts to call his wife. Then, he hears her phone ring from the other apartment. Francis can only wonder what is going on. At the same time, a little girl had been watching Weber all along from the opposite block. Weber realizes and then begins to make his way outside. However, as the crazy man heads out, he bumps into Francis at the entrance. Francis is surprised to see Weber there, in front of Irina's home. Just as he's about to pursue the strange-looking man who is about to escape, a series of loud gunshots are fired. Francis is startled. He watches Mr. Weber fall to the ground and slowly lose consciousness. The shocked man doesn't know what to make of the scene. A lifeless Mr. Weber and Julia, the one who fired the gun. The poor woman is covered in blood with an injured throat, almost losing consciousness. The movie ends with Julia slowly making her way out of Irina's house. She turns around to look at her beloved husband, who had waited to see her bleed before believing her.